Hello, good morning. It's great to be here. And a friend of mine, my colleague, says that she spoke here a couple of years ago and said that the Chicago Humanities Festival is the best audience she's ever had. So, well, wait, that raises a pretty high bar, right? So I'll test you later on. It's also great to be speaking about this book in Chicago, which is a city that literally the book begins in and in many ways ends in. And a really central part of the message that I try to get across in this book is that the civil rights movement was a national movement. It was addressing a national problem. It was not at all something that was restricted to the South. And in many ways, I think Chicago is iconic of that broader truth about the struggle for racial equality. Chicago was played a really central role in the mobilization for the March on Washington. Many people from this city played really central roles in building the march. A few of them, Tim Black, you may be familiar with, a teacher here, Addie Wyatt, a union activist here, and really thousands of people in this city. Maybe some of you, were any of you there at the March on Washington? Yeah? Okay, good. That's actually a test. I ask that question whenever I talk because I might not look like it, but I wasn't old enough to be at the March on Washington. So I actually try to filter out people who might know more about it than I do. The original idea for the March on Washington actually came from Chicago, a mass meeting in Chicago that was led by the great labor leader A. Philip Randolph, and an anonymous black woman, that's all we know about her, stood up from the floor and shouted, "Mr. Chairman, we ought to throw 50,000 Negroes around the White House, bring them from all over the country in jalopies, in trains, and any way we can get them there, and keep them there until we get some action from the White House." A. Philip Randolph, who was leading this mass meeting, liked the idea, and he took it up. He promised to put his union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, behind the idea, and he organized what would eventually be an estimated 100,000 people to descend on the nation's capital. As he described it, it would represent a cross-section of black America, Negro laborers, domestics, mechanics, and professionals. The idea was to gather at the nation's capital, at the Capitol building, march down Pennsylvania Avenue past the White House and the War Department, and then end with a massive rally at the Lincoln Memorial. They would divide into brigades representing every state in the nation. They'd be led by Boy Scouts and veterans of the Great War, holding banners that read, "Let American Negroes help America, total democracy for total defense, and if we are fit to fight, we are fit to work." And they'd walk in what A. Philip Randolph described as a solemn and determined fight for real democracy. Now, you may realize by now that this was not actually the March on Washington in 1963 that I've been describing, where Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, but a march that was planned 20 years before that in 1941 to protest discrimination against black workers and black soldiers in the defense industries and in the armed forces. That march was actually called off at the last minute, just a week before it was about to happen, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued an executive order banning discrimination by defense contractors who were in the process of gearing up for the Second World War. This was actually just before Pearl Harbor, so it was actually a year before Pearl Harbor, so the US hadn't actually directly entered the war. And this at the time was seen as a tremendous victory. Many black newspapers compared this to the Emancipation Proclamation. And in many ways, it was the first time since the Reconstruction that the first time in the 20th century that the federal government had really done anything on behalf of African Americans in a decisive way. At the same time, there were very important limitations to this victory. Perhaps most importantly, the executive order was issued as a temporary wartime emergency order. So it was issued to address the labor shortage that was created by the mobilization for the war, and therefore, the minute the war came to an end, the executive order would expire. It also did nothing to address discrimination in the armed forces themselves. It only covered federal contractors. And so A. Philip Randolph said at the time that African Americans needed to keep pushing and to ensure that this, which was sort of the basis of real change, would be realized in what he saw as a permanent law that would cover all employers, whether they were federal contractors, whether they were the government itself, or even whether they were private employers who had no direct relationship to the federal government. And this really, in many respects, launched a 20 to 25-year movement that we now know as the Civil Rights Movement. So this was in many ways the origin of this mass movement that would come to be known as the Civil Rights Movement. In fact, during the Second World War, A. Philip Randolph gave a commencement address at Morehouse University in Atlanta, where he called on the graduating class to dedicate themselves to what he called a 25-year struggle for democracy. I actually don't know if he attended this speech, but Martin Luther King was a sophomore at Morehouse, and it's very likely that he actually saw that speech, sort of presaging his role in this movement. Now, I think there's three reasons we need to know this history. Why do we need to know about this march that actually never happened? The march that was actually much smaller in its planning than the march that did happen, and one that, as I said, was called off. And there's three reasons. One, it helps us understand the success of the March on Washington that actually occurred in 1963 and the tremendous movement that was behind it. So we can't, I think often this is seen as often a spontaneous event, as if Martin Luther King sort of sent out a tweet, said, you know, meet me at the Lincoln Memorial, and 250,000 people showed up, right? And as you know, that's not what happened, right? In fact, it was a 20-year process of building a movement. We need to recognize some of the leaders in that movement, and in many respects, you know, this is an impossible process because it was such a tremendously mass movement. There were leaders and activists literally in every city across the country, and the vast majority of them remain unknown. In my book, I really try to give some life to some of the ones who are sort of just under the radar. I think two of the most important ones are Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin joined with A. Philip Randolph in organizing what came to be known as the March on Washington movement. He actually joined just after the march was called off and dedicated himself to taking up A. Philip Randolph's plan for building a 20-year or a 25-year struggle. Bayard Rustin is probably the person most responsible for alerting people to the strategies of nonviolent civil disobedience that were then being implemented in the struggle against British colonialism in India. He studied those movements. A lot of people were studying that movement in the United States. A lot of African Americans were talking about it, but he was the one who really tried to implement it, really starting during the Second World War. He also was the most important person in sort of popularizing that strategy after the Second World War. Bayard Rustin has largely been forgotten. He's starting to get some recognition. There's some great biographies of Rustin. There's a number of great films by him. He was awarded a Presidential Medal of Honor last year by President Obama. So he's starting to get some recognition. Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who played an equally important role, really remains largely unknown, although there's a great biography of her that is coming out in a year or so. She was the leader of what came to be known as the National Council for a Permanent FEPC. The executive order that President Roosevelt issued in 1941 created the Fair Employment Practices Council, which was a federal agency that was aimed at enforcing this executive order, so prohibiting defense contractors from discriminating, investigating cases of discrimination. It was a very weak organization, but it became, the idea of the FEPC became the sort of shorthand for this broader goal of passing a permanent law that would cover all employers. So the National Council for a Permanent FEPC led a national campaign to pass these laws. They were actually very successful at the local level. So a number of states and cities passed what were known as FEPC laws or FEP laws, prohibiting employment discrimination. And it was never, however, passed. It was not passed at the federal level and until 1964, until it was included in the Civil Rights Act. It would become known as Title VII in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'll get back to that, but this again, I think, shows the importance of these leaders who remain largely unknown. If Bayard Rustin brought the strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience to this movement, Anna Hedgeman really brought the idea of rooting this movement in mass organizations at a local level. She was a leader of the YWCA. She was also very closely connected to the National Council of Negro Women. And since the 1920s, really, she had been part of this nationwide movement of black women who organized in their community for a number of things. They were trying to address the fact that African American communities were deprived of public services, so they aimed at winning better schools, better things like better sewage, better health care for their communities. But in the 1940s, they took a decidedly political turn, and they started to lobby for actually passing laws. The National Council of Negro Women was the first agency to actually support an African American lobby in Washington, and a number of the really skilled black lobbyists, the first skilled black lobbyists in Washington were all women connected to these organizations. By the 1940s, the National Council of Negro Women was also the largest African American organization outside of the state. There were, outside of the church. So there were roughly 800,000 members of organizations and clubs that were affiliated with the National Council of Negro Women. So these two people really brought the ability to build a mass organization, and I think the organization that we would see really blossom in the 1950s and 1960s, in large part, can be attributed to the actions of these two individuals and a number of other people starting in the 1940s. So we have key leaders who emerge out of this movement in the 1940s who would continue to play a central role in building the civil rights movement. We have key strategies. I mentioned nonviolent civil disobedience. And at the time, both A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin and others pointed to nonviolent civil disobedience for a number of reasons. One, they argued that in the context of a small minority that has very little political power, building mass marches, was a way to sort of put pressure on elected officials in a way that you couldn't do through the ballot box, right? If you did not have the right to vote, or if you simply represented too small a minority to win elections, you could use this as a pressure tactic. But importantly, the reasoning behind this strategy was not just because it worked sort of in changing policy, but the mode of organization that it entailed was one that could involve a huge array of people, right? You didn't have to be well-educated. You didn't have to have money to participate in a mass march. And so it had a democratizing effect on the movement itself. And I think if you look at pictures from the 1950s and 1960s of civil rights marches, where you see these very young children, very poor people, people who are incredibly disempowered by their society, when they're participating in marches, they actually feel like they're participating in history, that they're making historical change. And this was something that A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin noted from the beginning. They said, it's not just that it works in the longer term, but it actually has a transformative impact on the people who are actually participating in it. As A. Philip Randolph said, it's a form of struggle for Negro rights in which all Negroes can participate, including the educated, the so-called uneducated, the rich, and poor. It is a technique and a strategy which the little Negro in the tavern, the pool room, on the streets, jitterbugs, storefront preacher, and sharecropper can use to help free the race, right? So it's not just that it has an impact, but it actually includes people and has an impact on the people who are actually participating. So we get these strategies, we get these organizations. I mentioned the women's organizations, the YWCA, the Black Women's Clubs. Another really central mobilizing institution in this story are trade unions. In many ways, the largest groups of people who came to the March on Washington in 1963 were brought there directly by either by the trade unions themselves. This was certainly the case in New York, which was actually the largest delegation of people at the March on Washington were from New York, and almost all of them came in trains and buses that were organized by the Garment Workers Union, the Meat Packers Union, the unions in New York City. In Chicago, the delegation was organized by the Negro American Labor Council, which was an organization of black trade unionists, which in Chicago was headed by Tim Black, who was involved in the teachers union at the time. He had also been a member of the packing house workers. These unions, without the support and the sort of the mobilizing ability of these unions, the march never would have taken place. In many ways, they were also these organizations were responsible for turning this into a mass movement. So in the 1940s, what A. Philip Randolph called the March on Washington movement was really just a handful of isolated radicals. People like him, who was an activist in the Socialist Party, Bayard Rustin, who was a former communist, still remained very committed to socialism. Bayard Rustin was also gay, and he was arrested in the 1950s for public sex, public homosexual sex. And this, again, sort of really marginalized him socially. The movement in the 1940s didn't really take off as a mass movement. In fact, much of the black press, most of the black leadership, the established black leadership, thought that it was a misguided strategy. They wanted to focus on more traditional strategies of lobbying and trying to mobilize people to vote. So they argued that this was not the sort of the future of the movement. The way in which it became the future of the movement, I think, however, was that the people who built it in the 1940s recognized an opportunity that was created by the eruption of these mass protests in the South, the most famous of them being the Montgomery bus boycott. But these local movements that erupted all across the South primarily focused on ending legalized segregation, the system known as Jim Crow, or winning the right to vote. And the eruption of these movements, which in many respects erupted out of frustration with the slow pace of change after the Second World War, was seen as an opportunity by people like A. Philip Randolph, by Bayard Rustin, Anna Hedgeman, who started to channel money and supplies and resources into the South. So the packing house workers here in Chicago, for example, was probably the most important source of funding for the Montgomery bus boycott. They channeled hundreds of thousands of dollars into the South to support what they, again, saw as this sort of rising opportunity Bayard Rustin went to Montgomery and literally trained Martin Luther King in nonviolent civil disobedience. He actually talks about going to Montgomery. From the very beginning, Martin Luther King talked about this being a nonviolent movement. He, as a student at Morehouse in the 1940s, he heard about the movement in India. He was very aware of it. But when Bayard Rustin went to Montgomery, it was very clear to him that Martin Luther King hadn't really studied this movement or this strategy. And the reason that he recognized it from the beginning, when he walked up to Martin Luther King's house, he saw people perched on the roof with shotguns guarding the house. And then he went inside and he noticed that there were handguns all over the living room. He talks about somebody came in and was going to sit down on the couch, and he said, wait, before you sit down, let me move this handgun. You don't want to sit on it. And he said, Martin Luther King, I know you're committed to nonviolence, but let's think about how we can present a public image that actually conforms to this strategy, right? So he was a strategist. He had been studying this by that point for over a decade. And he sort of brought the movement in line with these broader goals. So in many ways, we can't understand what happened in the 1950s and the 1960s without understanding the long roots of this movement in the movement that began in 1941. The second reason we really have to understand this is to understand what the goals of this movement were. And I think in the popular imagery, there's still the perception that the primary goal, perhaps even the sole aim of this movement, was to win racial equality before the law, sort of legal equality in a very narrow sense. The goals of the movement are also primarily understood as transforming the system of Jim Crow in the South. And if we take this longer historical view, we recognize that actually this movement began in Chicago, right? Where black people had the right to vote. They weren't legally segregated in restaurants, although there were many restaurants that did that, right? So this was not primarily a movement that was sort of prioritized the issue of legal equality as its certainly as its sole goal, but in many ways even as its primary goal. The initial motivation for this movement was the struggle for jobs, for a decent, well-paid job, a job that, in the language of the movement, paid a living wage. The idea that people need to have access to decent jobs, they need access to decent schools, decent housing, not just the integrations of schools, but the creation of functioning schools. Not just the integration of housing, but decent housing. And again, these were not simply Southern problems, right? These were national problems. And from the beginning, the movement made that their primary sort of objective, to create a national transformation. I think you can see this actually in the official goals of the movement itself, of the March on Washington. One thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that in June of 1963, President John F. Kennedy proposed to Congress a civil rights bill. And many people have taken that. This was 2 months before the March on Washington. And this is often seen as evidence that the real sort of events that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which would be passed a year later in 1964, were really driven by events in Washington. You had a liberal president who was sympathetic to these ideas. He came out very powerfully on national television and said, the issue of civil rights is a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. So in terms of setting that sort of moral tone, setting the ball rolling, this was done before the March on Washington occurred. So it raises the question, why did they go through all the trouble? Why did all those people go to Washington? And one reason was to ensure passage, to push for passage of the bill. So a repeated chant. You can actually watch television footage from the march, and repeatedly the whole crowd breaks out into the chant, pass the bill, pass the bill, pass the bill. This actually happened when there were a number of senators and Congress people who came and sort of showed their face at the march, and that's the greeting they got. Pass the bill, pass the bill. But it's important to keep in mind that that was only the first step in these demands. So there was a whole list of 10 demands. The first one was the passage of a comprehensive Civil Rights Act. They wanted, in a number of things, they echoed the law that Kennedy had proposed. So they wanted to ban discrimination in public spaces. They wanted to ban discrimination in voting rights. Those were the first 2 demands of the march out of 10. And if you continue down that list, you recognize that that was just the beginning. One thing that they wanted to do was they wanted to dramatically expand the power of the federal government to enforce those rights. So one thing they said was they wanted the federal government to be able to withhold federal funds from any local agency that discriminated. So it was a housing agency, can't get federal funds unless they treat everybody equally. So they wanted to increase the power of Kennedy's bill, but they also wanted to dramatically expand it. One thing that was particularly controversial was expanding the anti-discrimination measures to cover what were known at the time as public accommodations. These were private businesses that served the public, a restaurant, a hotel. And this was actually, the primary opponent to this idea was Senator Dirksen from Illinois. And he argued, you know, look, we need to get rid of discrimination and segregation in the South, but we can't tell a private store owner or a private business what they can do on private property. The federal government has no role in regulating private property. The biggest opponents to this pointed to the fact that many people rented out rooms in their own homes. And so this would mean that if anybody who showed up on somebody's doorstep would have to be allowed into somebody's home. So this was a violation of property rights. Kennedy actually floated the idea of including this in the Civil Rights Bill, but then he withdrew it after Senator Dirksen from Illinois opposed it. Even more controversial than that was the addition of Kennedy's bill of an FEPC law. And this is the language that they used at the time, of a Fair Employment Practices Law, banning discrimination in employment on the basis of race, color, national origin, or religion. This also, Dirksen and a number of Northern Republicans said they would absolutely not support a bill that would do these things. So already in the official demands of the march, we're going far beyond the bill that Kennedy envisioned. They also said none of these things would be effective without very radical reforms to the economy in ways that would not just help African Americans, but would help any American gain access to a job that paid a living wage. So they called for a massive federal jobs creation program to train and place all unemployed workers, Negro and white, in meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages. They wanted to raise the minimum wage to a level that they said would give all Americans a decent standard of living. At the time, they called for raising it to $2 an hour. Anybody want to guess what that would be in today's dollars? 10? More? It'd be between $14 and $15 an hour. It's actually, there's a push actually to bring it back up. So the people who are asking for a $15 minimum wage are really just repeating this call. One thing that's interesting, if you go back and you look at the television reporting, if you look at the newspapers the day after the March on Washington, these goals and this objective of passing the bill, but then going far beyond it, was clearly reported. The New York Times, the day after the March on Washington, devoted almost its entire first section. So the whole first section of the paper covered interviews with the organizers, interviews with people who were there, a number of stories about these demands. So it was actually very clear at the time. I think in hindsight, we've lost track of this. We've forgotten it. But it wasn't actually forgotten at the time. One thing that you see is that in the speeches, there were actually 10 official speeches at the Lincoln Memorial. A. Philip Randolph gave the first one, and he started by saying, we are here as part of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom. And he went through explaining why it was so important to couple this push for equal equality, not just with stronger enforcement, but with a broader effort to address poverty and economic inequality in society. And this was repeated over and over and over again. The speakers who followed him echoed that, even people who actually had not said things like that before. So Roy Wilkins, who was in many ways the most moderate of the leaders that day, really lashed out at Kennedy for having a very weak bill, one that would not address the struggle for jobs. Ironically, the one speech that was given that day that anybody ever remembers was the last one. It was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And he was actually chosen to give that speech because everybody knew he would knock it out of the park, right? He was widely known. The story is actually that when they were saying, they were sort of putting together the program, a number of people said, well, this guy, he's really young. He's actually he's kind of a newcomer to this movement. I've been around in the trenches for decades. Why does he get to give the last speech, the keynote? And A. Philip Randolph said, well, okay, who wants to follow him? And he gave the last speech. Nobody. So everybody knew that he would give a tremendous speech, but it was also important to remember that he didn't actually have to be very specific about what the march was about. He didn't have to go and list the demands. He didn't have to talk about the connections between economic justice and racial equality, although he did. He alluded to them, but in rather vague terms. The New York Times said it was ironic that King, the guy who had actually suffered the most, his house had been bombed when his wife and children were there. He had been in the trenches. The New York Times said it was ironic that he gave the most forgiving and uplifting of the speeches, while the other leaders focused on the struggle ahead and spoke in tough, even harsh language, right? So he was the one who gave an uplifting speech to send people back. A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin actually came on right after him and read the full list of the demands and then led everybody in a pledge that they would go home and they would not stop fighting until they realized all those demands. So nobody overlooked what this march was about, except if you take that one speech, and that's the only one that you remember. And at this point, it's probably the most widely known piece of rhetoric in American history, but we don't know the context in which it was delivered, and therefore we miss really largely the whole point of that event. And this, I think, gets at the third reason why we really need to know this history. It's not just a matter of sort of setting the record straight. I think it really helps us understand what this movement means to us today and what its legacy was for us today. One thing I think that's important to keep in mind is the degree to which the March on Washington transformed what would come to be known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So you may know that it actually did include the FEPC law, a provision that Kennedy himself opposed. It actually not only included an FEPC law that banned employment discrimination by any employer, whether they're a private employer or a government, whether they have a contract with the government or not. Anybody who runs a business has to apply by this law. It also expanded that law to prohibit discrimination not just on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin, but also to prohibit discrimination based upon sex. And this is a longer story than I have time to get into, but it actually is directly related to the role of black women in this movement in pushing for that provision. It's also the provision in the law that many people recognize as having the broadest impact, in part because it also prohibited sex discrimination against white women, who were a much larger group of the workforce, right? So it had a much broader impact. It also included the Public Accommodations Clause, which in many cases is the second most powerful provision of this law. Remember, this was a clause that, that President Kennedy agreed to take out of the law after the objections from Senator Dirksen. So in many ways, the law that we have now looks very different, in some respects not at all like the law that Kennedy had proposed and pushed for in 1963. We also forget the degree that the central message of the march, that racial equality would be impossible. Not that it wouldn't mean anything, but it would be impossible without a broader effort to create a more just society for all people who work for a living, right? The idea that economic justice and racial equality go hand in hand. This was actually also largely, or to a certain extent, realized under the Johnson administration, which recognized that and always said from the very first speech that Johnson gave after Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson took power, he said, we need to couple these civil rights laws with efforts to address poverty. And this is the recognition out of which the war on poverty came, which was actually much weaker, much more scaled back than most civil rights leaders had been pushing for, but it did do a number of important things. It created an important incentive for job creation in funding things like education and housing and healthcare. Largely in cities. This created jobs in those sectors. These were public service jobs that overwhelmingly went to African Americans. And a lot of historians at this point recognize this creation of public service jobs in the late 1960s and early 1970s was probably the most important vehicle for lifting African Americans out of poverty in that period. And I think it's important to keep in mind the degree to which the effectiveness of these policies. So if you look at, I resisted the temptation to put a whole bunch of charts up. That's what I do to my students, but I'll only give you two. One is a chart showing the progress on integration of schools in the South, right? And if you look at the progress, it's really remarkable. Starting exactly in 1964, so the Brown decision was passed in 1954, 10 years before that. We don't see any progress in that 10-year period. Suddenly, there's a period of really dramatic progress. The other one I would point to shows the poverty rates broken down by race. And we see that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we see the most dramatic reduction in poverty in the post-war era. It actually aids all people regardless of their race, but it disproportionately aids African Americans. So the disparity between black and white poverty rates narrows between 1965 and 1975. And I say this, I point this out because it's important to keep in mind that these things actually worked, right? I mean, how many times do we hear the quip, we fought a war on poverty and poverty won, right? That's absolutely not true if you look at these charts. And in that sense, I think it's important to keep in mind that these recommendations that largely came from the leadership of the March on Washington and were implemented in very close dialogue with that leadership actually had a tremendous impact both on poverty and racial inequality in this country for a 10-year period. And then they were reversed. We see a revolt against federal enforcement powers, a rhetoric of small government and states' rights, the idea that the government is the problem, not the solution, that the rights of private businesses and the rights of property owners transcend the rights of people to be treated equally and dignified. And this was actually an argument that A. Philip Randolph addressed directly in his speech at the Lincoln Memorial. He said, somebody's property rights do not transcend, do not give them the right to humiliate me because of the color of my skin. And he said, we need to create a society in which property rights take second place to the value of the human personality. And this is, I think, the way in which, in some ways, I think we see the March on Washington as a turning point in American history, but I think we see it, in some ways, we misunderstand what actually changed. It actually, if you look at public opinion polls, after the March on Washington, ideas, sort of the commitment to segregation and white supremacy, we don't see a big change. In fact, in some ways, I think the march hardened positions on both sides. You actually saw that most dramatically in Chicago, where the week after the March on Washington, there were mass marches in downtown on City Hall in Chicago protesting a law, an open housing law. This was a law that prohibited discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And there were mass marches. These were mostly housewives with children marching against City Hall, asking to revoke that law and to overturn that law. So this was the week after the March on Washington. What I do think happened, however, was a shift in the way of thinking about the relationship between equality and the broader economy, and particularly the power of the federal government and the need for a powerful federal government to enforce these laws. And in some ways, I think it started a debate that we're still having in this country as to whether we're going to have a government that enforces people's dignity over the rights of property. I don't want to go on any longer because I want to hear your questions, but thank you very much for your time and your questions.
If there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and Gabe or I will try and get the mic to you.
Yes, I have a question about the, later on, Martin Luther King organized the Poor People's March, right?
Yeah.
Can you maybe speak to that a bit or see that in the context of this march?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, certainly for the, within the civil rights movement, there was a very long-standing recognition of this connection that I drew between sort of fighting for racial equality and fighting for economic justice. In many ways, I think, in some ways, there's a perception that I think historians share that people became more aware of these connections after the march. And in some ways, I think it actually reflected an increasing frustration with the ability to make those connections. People were very much aware of them before. So the Poor People's Movement was an effort initiated by Martin Luther King's SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to mobilize a multiracial movement of poor people to push for against the limitations on the war on poverty. So the argument was that the war on poverty didn't go far enough. It didn't do enough to address the job crisis, and actually a big issue here in Chicago was what they called to address the problems of the working poor. So to make the argument that it wasn't just about unemployment, but it was that people had jobs that weren't actually paying a living wage. So this was part of this movement that Martin Luther King tried to mobilize through organizing another march on Washington. Actually, the plan was to go back to Washington and demand. The other problem was that the increasing involvement in the war in Vietnam was channeling resources away from what the war on poverty actually was doing. So the war on poverty wasn't enough, but it was actually being undermined by the increasing expenditures in Vietnam. And so that was the effort to sort of focus this. Martin Luther King launched, the plan was to launch this march. He actually went to Memphis, Tennessee to launch the march, where there was a strike by garbage workers, sanitation workers in Memphis that he was trying to support, and that's where he was assassinated. So in some ways, the assassination of Martin Luther King sort of cut off the beginnings of this movement. They did do a march on Washington. They camped. They set up an encampment on the National Mall. I think in some ways, I think it reflected the difficulties of trying to move outside of the sort of African-American civil rights movement and the difficulties of creating bonds to other civil rights movements. So they tried to reach out to the Chicano movement, for example, to the farm workers movement, to the American Indian movement. In some ways, it reflected a sort of blossoming of these social movements in the 1960s, but it did not succeed, I think, in sort of focusing the agenda in the way that the '63 march had.
We'll take our next question right here.
Thank you so much for your illuminating talk. You mentioned the early vision of the march having a more radical vision under Randolph and Rustin, and then, to my understanding, there was some conflict in the march in '63 with John Lewis and what he was said, or I was wondering if you could illuminate some of that tension with Lewis's intended speech and what he delivered, he being the only living person who spoke at that march.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because it's sort of a pet peeve of mine. So one thing that's frustrating when I teach about this is if you go on the internet and you Google John Lewis March on Washington, you'll find the march, the text of the speech that John Lewis didn't give. And the reason for that is because he was the representative of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was the most radical, the young wing of the movement. And they wrote a speech that was an incredibly fiery, very radical speech. And somebody circulated it like the night before the march, and people blew up. People said, this is just, we can't have people saying this. So the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., had been asked to give the convocation at the beginning of the march. He said, I'm not going to endorse this march if this speech is given. And his objection was that John Lewis used very radical language. He used languages like revolution and the masses. And to which A. Philip Randolph said, well, I'm going to use the same language. I mean, this guy was a socialist. He didn't have any problem with that language. He said, I'm not going to tell him to take that out. So actually what's frustrating is that it's very hard to actually find the speech that John Lewis actually gave. There were two very important differences between the two speeches. One, John Lewis was going to say, he was going to call on people to get in the streets. He said, we need to get in the streets. We need to go into the South. We need to march through the South like Sherman did and burn Jim Crow to the ground, nonviolently. And this they actually got him to tone down. But it was actually, I think importantly, it was Bayard Rustin, the guy who had been in the South trying to implement nonviolent civil disobedience by this point for over 20 years, who had actually gotten beaten almost to death for doing that. He said, we can't have a nonviolent movement using this type of language and rhetoric. So he convinced him to change it. The other important thing was that he was going to say SNCC cannot endorse Kennedy's civil rights bill. To which a number of leaders said, but that's why we're here, right? I mean, you don't have to love it, but say we want to pass it, and then get beyond it, right? We want to get more. So they actually got him to change it slightly. He said, we're not comfortable with it, or I don't remember the language, but he said, it's not enough. And in fact, if you look at his actual speech, he gave an incredibly fiery speech, but it was actually very similar to the speeches that were given by Randolph and the other leaders. So one of my frustrations is that this gets sort of remembered as a case where the movement was watered down. And that's actually the way in which it's taught in a lot of textbooks. And I think that actually really importantly misses the degree to which this movement remained tremendously radical. I mean, if you actually listen to the speech that he gave, he said, the civil rights bill is too little, too late, or something. He said, we need a civil rights bill that will ensure the equality of a homeless person. We need a civil rights bill that will ensure the equality of a maid who earns $5 a week in a household that has an income of $100,000 a year, right? So this really radical attack on inequality that he actually gave and delivered, and I think and John Lewis himself says, I didn't change that. I changed the speech, but it didn't change the message. Yeah, thanks. So there's
Good morning.
Yeah, we need to use the mics. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry. So I attended the 50th anniversary year and a half back because my dad was one of the folks who originally marched. And it just felt, the whole call for some of the same parts was just felt like milk toast a little bit, you know. And I was wondering about the sort of the infrastructure that led to the 63 march that seemed, based on your chart, seemed to be very effective. What is it that we can learn from that today about the income gap that continues to grow and we've made no impact on that? Is there anything that the movement has thought about that was successful then that could be used now?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I was there too, and I had this similar thought. In some ways, I think it was an impossible charge, though, right? I mean, you can't 50 years later replicate something that was so dramatic. Even the idea of a March on Washington was incredibly radical at the time. So if you read the newspapers the week leading up to the March on Washington in '63, the story is all about how this is going to turn into a riot, about how they had mobilized troops. They emptied all the city jails because they were going to fill them up with troublemakers. They closed all the liquor stores in town. Most federal agencies shut down. They were terrified at this, right? And so in some respects, by the success of the March on Washington, a march is no longer that big a threat, right? It's not as big a deal. So it's hard to replicate that kind of thing. I do think you could see elements of the same dynamics, however. For example, I think unions played a really important role in getting people to the 50th anniversary march. There were actually two celebrations, in large part because unions wanted to have one on Saturday where people could attend. They wanted to have one that actually raised these issues in a pointed way. And then on the actual anniversary was the one that was an official government one in which the president spoke. So in some ways, I think you could see elements of it. But I think we don't have a mass movement in the way that existed then. Unions are far weaker. I mean, in 1963, unions were still largely at their peak. So representing roughly 30% of the workforce. Now it's closer to 10%. So the sort of infrastructure that mobilized people, I think we don't have as much. Yeah.
I'm sorry. The question I have is about equality. Now we're seeing, my question about equality is, now we're seeing young people who are highly unemployed, and we're seeing also, if we have so many policies on the books, how is it that police officers are able to shoot the Trayvon Martins, and how effective are the policies on the books right now? Because it's more than just the Trayvon Martins. You know, we can hear in every major city. So if you argue that that is an important movement to our history, how effective are the policies if the lawmakers are not enforcing them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, part of, the push for, so one of the demands of the March on Washington was that the Attorney General have the ability to initiate a lawsuit when any constitutional right is violated. And they made it very clear that the federal government needed not just to pass laws, but to empower the executive branch to enforce those laws. And I think you can see with the events in Ferguson, the way in which, I think the Attorney General actually played a very important role in going there and sort of highlighting it, but there are very important limits on his ability to intervene in the police force, to intervene in the case, that I think show, again, that importance of having enforcement power that I think certainly in the past 25 years, maybe in the past 50 years, we've seen a really concerted effort, I think, to undermine the enforcement power behind the laws. So we see that with the voting rights laws as well. The most recent Supreme Court case over voting rights did not challenge the principle that everybody should have a right to vote regardless of their race. What it challenged was the ability of the federal government to intervene and enforce that right. And now we've seen this, I think there's clear evidence that we saw in an election last Tuesday that was influenced by the fact that we've had these restrictions on voting rights. So I think, in many ways, I think that question of what power does the government have to enforce it, and the idea that we can have, an equal society without a powerful government is, I think, misguided.
So we're going to take our last question. I do want to ask, is there anyone on the other side of the house that has a question? This, again, will be our last question. I also want to remind you all that if you are starting to get a little hungry, we do have food trucks outside in the plaza.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Just in light of the last two questions, maybe you could dig a little bit deeper and give us your opinion on how we might get back to what seems like the fervor that so many people had at that time from the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s to make the government do what it should do. And perhaps, for lack of a better term, I'll say make this country live up to its promises to all people.
Yeah.
How would you suggest that we get people together the way they did at that time and were so effective in making change? Because clearly, evidenced by your charts, we've gone up and then, certainly in light of recent events.
Right. I mean, I think part of it is winning an argument about the need for, and insisting that we need the government. I mean, it's not, that getting the government out of our hands, might be good for some people, but it's not good for all of us. But I also think that there are really concrete sort of things that I think we need to build institutions. We need to, so Twitter can do a lot. Facebook can mobilize people for what happened in Ferguson, but it can't sustain a movement. And particularly, I think it can't in a democratic way, frame the demands of a movement. The way in which a union, a civil rights organization, I mean, join the NAACP and get involved in it and help to build it. Some other organization, join a union, build an organization in which you and the people around you have some control at a local level and can influence policy at the national level. And we're never going to get back to this kind of thing through social media. I think the idea that that communication is what we need, that's important, but we need these infrastructure and we need these grassroots organizations. So thank you, all of you, for coming out and listening to this. It's been a great conversation.